Well, nice 4-day weekend coming to a close. I've got some building done. It's a crazy American holiday we call Thanksgiving. I'm thankful for it anyway. Get some time off, get to see some family, and eat some food. Been working a lot recently with Brett Hahn in New Mexico. He's the importer that I'm going through for my Verner radial engine. I've submitted my design to him that I used SolidWorks for the engine mount. I can't take any measurements for things like dodging around the intake tubes and so forth, so we've gone back and forth. He's cut out some, we call them paper dolls, to test out full-scale examples. And as long as I had the model on screen for the engine mount, I also went back and looked at the oil tank location and it was called a boot cowl before. It's actually, I think technically called an accessory cowl. Covers up, starter motor, carburetor, all that crap on the back of the engine. So, and speaking of carburetors, this engine doesn't have one anymore. That's one of the other options which I ordered through Brett was the airflow performance throttle body fuel injection system. So that is all on hand. I got some pictures of the engine mount, the theoretical ones anyway, and a couple pictures that I'll put in here where you can see the fuel injection throttle body on the back of the engine. There's two different versions. One of them has a 90-degree elbow, which could be updraft or side draft in two directions. Or I can run a straight side draft straight out the back of the engine, which is my intention. So he's going to make a straight through adapter, and whether it's that 90-degree elbow that you can see in the picture or the straight adapter, which is not in the picture, both of them have to be modified to put in the two injector nozzles, which get put at the base. And so his welder should be working on that this week. And the one last dimension that I've been kind of holding off on is based on that adapter plate, we'll call it, for the fuel injection, to make sure that I have sufficient clearance from the firewalls. All of this is stuff I've modeled up in SolidWorks based on measuring up the front of my airplane, the firewall, edges of the boot cowl that I have, the actual boot cowl, and a bunch of modeling. And the other cool thing which has happened this week is that my propeller finally arrived. I took a gamble and I ordered a prop from Meglin. You'll see them advertising on Barnstormers. I've seen them advertised on the EAA forum. So these are embedded stainless edges, full carbon fiber. These blades all weigh exactly 1,087 grams, not any variation whatsoever within them. The prop hub, it's a ground adjustable. Basically, it's just a clamping fixture like a lot of the experimental airplanes use. So who knows what my final pitch will be. That's why I would insist that the first prop I use is going to be ground adjustable, and we'll see what we come up with after that. But anyway, so this is a thing of beauty. Each of the blades came with their, call it a raincoat or a doggy sweater, and can't wait to actually fit that to the airplane. It's gonna be cool. As far as actual work on the airplane goes, you can see behind me that I have the Laker leading edges. The 4 pieces are fitted and bonded. I did say that I wasn't gonna film any of that or have anything on here, but there's a few things that I stumbled across along the way that I thought I'd share. So not to make it exhaustive, hopefully I'll make that short. Before I got started on the Laker leading edges, I did finish fitting up those flaperons up there. Those are my junk flaperons. I did the repair and riveted just for practice on the back edge of those, and I filmed all that, so that'll be included. You may or may not be able to see that I scalloped the aft edge of the Laker leading edge, and I'll explain more of that as we get into the episode. And while I've been bonding these pieces on one at a time and waiting for the high sol to cure, I go back inside and whip out the laptop, and using my still operating free seat of SolidWorks as courtesy of the EAA membership, sadly that seat is going to go away at some point. I should probably figure out how much time I have left on that. SolidWorks is an outstanding program. I do own a seat of it somewhere, 2013. The 2020 version, which I downloaded through the EAA website, has enough added features that I hadn't looked back. I thought it was going to be one of those things I could count on having for quite a while. So anyway, while I've been waiting for that epoxy to cure, I run back in there, work on that design for the motor mount, the accessory cowl, and also just yesterday whipped out the design I'd started for my instrument panel. I'll put in some pictures of that here too. And so my excuse right now is that I put on some superfill over the junction at rib number 5, and also the aft edge where it figures into the fuel tank. And I have the aluminum strips that I cut ready to drill and provision for the ends of the wingtips on rib number 10 so I can mount the wingtips. And speaking of those, I went to my hangar today, picked up my wingtips that I have over there. I only have one set, believe it or not. These are the Horner style wingtips. They are not the prettiest wingtips to look at, but if you do look up Horner, he was a World War II German aerodynamicist. Man knew what he was doing. They deal with wingtip vortices very well, and they also increase the effective span. And besides that, they're the only ones I have. So they're the ones I'm going to fit up to the wings. I don't like the fact that they seem pretty heavy, being made out of fiberglass. If I could get a carbon splash of those or find some other kind of wingtip, I might go that way, but for now, that's what I've got. Once those are trimmed, I'm going to set them aside. Those aluminum strips will be fitted, and it'll be time to cover, so it's going to be pretty awesome. And I have my gas heater here going. It's been pretty noisy. I just shut it off for this. So I'm going to go back inside, do some more drawing, but in the meantime, welcome to episode 19. Well, towards the end of episode 18, I outlined how my flaperons are junk and I had to order a new set, but I decided to use them for the purposes of hanging the flaperon brackets and moving on forward with wings. So that up there is the flaperon that had the disbonded section, and when I started getting ready to kind of do my temporary fix, I found out that it was actually the majority of the trailing edge was disbonded, but there was just enough of it that all I had to do was put adhesive in there and clamp it, and it was still very much in rig. So, and then I went ahead and did the rivets, and before I'm done here, I will do something to make sure that these flaperons never end up on an airplane. You'll notice I'm keeping the steel brackets attached to that flaperon. When the new flaperons show up, I will take those brackets off one at a time, put them on the new flaperon, because those variations and all those hole patterns will put me back on the wing where it's supposed to go. So as far as the fine-tuning adjustments to get them to be super floppy, that's one of those things I suspect is going to be like installing our rudder pedals or the control column in the airplane that's going to go in and out of the plane so many times that you're going to replace the hardware before you get happy with the way it works. So time to ditch the camera. I'll drill up these holes. This flaperon will come back off. It'll go back up on the wall. Then I'm going to tip these wings up. I still have to do my false ribs for the bottom of the tank. I've got them cut. I need to bond those in place. I've got a little bit of varnish touch-up to do. And then it's Laker leading edge and the wingtip strips on rib number 10. Well, I'm not sure I have enough hands to do this, but what I'm doing now is I've got these false ribs, and like I said, I'm only doing one on each side of the number 2 rib. And right away I could see that they're a little bit warped. It'd be difficult to keep them straight. So I took this piece of wood. It's one of the same ones I used for actually installing the false ribs before. And I have coated it with a piece of clear packing tape. Probably can't see that, but it's going to keep any adhesive that squishes out from bonding the wood to the rib and to the tank, because that would be not good. So, but with the tape on there, it should serve as a release. I have the 2 pieces that I'm going to use. I have a way to index them with these. You can see the tick marks I made also on ribs number 1 and 3, and also there's still the marks I haven't cleaned off of rib number 2 yet. And I've got my high saw in the house warming up because it's pretty cold today. I will just run it across this entire edge and bond it on here, and that should work. So like I said, I just put a bead on the edge of the false rib that's going to go in here. I've clamped it up against the side of this fairing stick to hold it straight and to hold it tight against the tank. So it's going to gap fill underneath. I'll come back and make a fillet on both sides when it's done. So I've given the adhesive on these 2 false ribs overnight. It's actually pretty cold, about 45 degrees outside. I operated a gas heater in here last night for about an hour and a half to make sure this stuff would kick off pretty well. The sticks I used for holding these in place work perfectly. They just popped right out when I was done. So now I'm going to cut 2 more of these false ribs for this tank. I said I wasn't going to film any of the installation of the Laker leading edge installation, but I decided to cover just these little pieces because I wasn't seeing a whole lot in detail on other people's build threads or their videos. And the reason is because it's not that hard. So this is another example of where I started to go down a rabbit trail of trying to figure out a way to make a line on the leading edge that would allow me to super accurately locate all these little pieces. So I thought I could do better than the template, and I can't. So one of the things I did before I cut the leading edge into the 1.5 pieces is I figured out which was the bottom side, and I made this line, Sharpie line, across the whole piece of material before I cut it. That way there was no chance that I had to spend any time thinking about what the proper orientation was. And then I did use that template, and sometimes there's a little bit of a gap, but it's okay. You just center it as absolutely best as you can. Use that piece of tape where you can make a hinge and you can double check. I went through every one of them, and then I stood on this end of the wing and I sighted down that little piece of I-beam reinforcement, and it looked pretty good. So with them located with the template, one piece of tape which allows you to get underneath there. There's a couple of them. One on this side where I had a clearance around that rivet, and another rivet on this one. Statistical probability, I didn't have a problem with this side at all. You can see what I did here. Came back with masking tape and a Sharpie pen, and I managed to figure out where all of the bonding surfaces were going to be. Scuffed that up with a Scotch-Brite pad, and then I came back with a piece of sandpaper, and I just used my hand and sanded the bond surfaces of these pieces of extrusion. So now what I'm going to end up doing is cleaning everything up with denatured alcohol. The whole trick for bonding anything is super clean, nicely scuffed surface, and high salt that's at the right temperature. I just got some tubes of this EA 9460, recent shipment. These will come in super handy for doing this job. So I'm just replacing the pieces of tape as I go along here. Just did this one, recheck to the template. I don't know if you'll be able to see that. Probably not. Anyway, so this is getting a little bit tired. There's a little bit of motion in there because I did the original positioning of this and the sanding of both parts, and then the cleanup. Got a little bit of alcohol in the tape, so the tape starts to get a little bit loose and then gets wrinkly. So I'm just going to replace the piece of tape and have all these done. And I doubt you'll be able to see it, but this template just takes a little bit of best fitting. It's actually pretty good right there. So then I'm just going to make sure it's visually centered this way. Hold it in place. Pull the template. Put the new piece of tape on. Make sure to get in there. It's on real good. Hinge works. And check it again. It's gonna have to do. So a little trick I learned today, I was pretty impressed with myself. Instead of just using a cutoff wheel on a Dremel style tool like this, I found that this stuff with a pair of aircraft tin snips cuts basically like paper. And you might have just caught it right there, but just like when you're cutting on a piece of metal with these, if you have any chops at all, you know not to complete the stroke, but to stop and move. And I will actually do this on purpose so you can see what happens if you don't do it right. See how that just delaminated some layers right there? So if instead you just keep making shorter strokes, you can cut a nice continuous edge. So once I figured this out, because I actually was just going to try it to cut off, you know, roughly and then cut in with the Dremel style tool, I tried this, and man, I was so impressed that now what I'm doing is I will cut this piece right here with the Dremel where it goes around a corner radius like this, but anything that's even remotely straight, like these long edges right here, just cut them with the tin snips. It's super fast, no dust, no mess, and what do you know? Well, this is my right wing. Just a few minutes ago I finished bonding on both pieces, got one done, had a little bit of time to burn, proceeded on with the rest of it. I'm still gonna pull out these Clecos per the manual instructions. So for each of these sections I ended up mixing up exactly 60 grams of high sol, and then also used my high sol gun. I got most of the high sol laid down with the big syringe. Then I started in with the bonding on the false ribs, and as soon as I ran out in that 60 gram syringe, rather than stop and make up some more, I just grabbed that gun and did the rest. And when you're working by yourself, you make a little bit of mistakes, so that you can see where there's a couple lines where I touched down on the adhesive before I got going. Really not a big mess. It's laying down pretty smooth, both these pieces, so pretty happy with the way this came out. So I'm going to crank up the heat here. It's not super cold today, but just make sure it has a good chance of bonding correctly. And then once the adhesive has cured, obviously all the clamps and everything will come off, I can start the sanding and fill and fair and working on this little step. I think it was Harlan Payne's video where he talked about sanding this to a knife edge. I think if I was to do another one of these airplanes, I fully agree. I would probably knife edge the underside, and so that you could taper it down, be a minimum amount of filling. And as it is, I'm still going to try and get away with the minimum I can. I have my random orbit sander that'll help me knock this burr off. I kind of wish I would have done that before I got going here. Then see how much of the, I always call it Smurf poop, superfill, it takes to fill up some of these imperfections. Well, I'm going to look and see if I can find whose build thread it was that suggested to do these scallops in each of the bays where the false ribs go. And the reason for doing this is because with the straight edge right here, you get kind of a sharp break where the fabric starts to draw down in between the ribs. And this is supposed to ease that transition. I wasn't sure that I was going to do it. In fact, I was pretty sure it was going to be too much work. But when I was getting these fiberglass pieces fitted up and I was getting some of that waviness, there's some puckers that you just can't get rid of. And I wondered if this would cure it. And I'm here to say that it does. So I just saw in my own build thread where Lauren Voigt said, don't worry about it. Even if you're doing the Oratex, it pulls it tight enough that it would push down on the high spots and up on the low. And he said this looks beautiful, and I'm sure it does, but I was already had these marked out. And all I did was mark the center of the ribs, and I came back with actually a 1 gallon paint can, made the scallops, and then these are actually the first ones I cut, and I left a little bit extra material, but with a little bit of practice, and I'll show it right here, I was able to cut these with the tin snips. I could cut in part way and then come back and finish them. So I just did both wings. It took under an hour, so yes, my hand is cramped up, but I was able to get near net. I didn't undercut anything. Pretty happy with the way that came out. And now I will come back with a sander, but there's a whole lot less material. And you can see I'm not covered in dust. I didn't have to wear a dust mask, respirator, or any of that crap. My shop isn't dirty. You can see all these scallops of fiberglass that I cut off of here. So far, super happy with the way these came out. I am going to get my drum sander now, hit these, and then I can start working on how I'm going to do the superfill to make everything else beautiful. So now I'm looking at several hours of manual labor, and I don't think this is actually more labor than if I'd gone with a PVC leading edge. And that was actually one of the deciding factors, is because with a little bit of exposed aluminum tube and the small piece of PVC, I really thought that was probably going to be more labor than what I'm doing here. And since I haven't built one of each, I'll never know. But this plan I'm working on so far is working out okay. What I did is I just ran a piece of masking tape across here, filled it with a superfill, and then came across with actually it was just a piece of scrap carbon fiber, and put a taper to it and very lightly sanded it now. This is rib number 5, where the junction between the two pieces goes. And it actually came out better than I thought. The superfill does sand pretty easily. It's not very hard material. It does fill pretty well. A few imperfections that I'll come back. It's going to take a second coat. Then you can see on these ends down here, I also kind of did the same thing I did on the tank, so I could taper it down. It's going to require a second coat, fill in, and then hopefully you can't see it, but I used a little bit of high sol instead of the superfill back here, and I just kind of was winging it, and I sanded it down. It actually is pretty smooth. This is not the best example. It's going to take a little bit of manual labor again. This is going to take a little more sanding. Well, the rest of this is straight up manual labor. It's sanding, it's putting some more filler on, giving it a day or two to cure properly, and doing some more sanding, probably making some mistakes. I'm going to have some touch-up varnish I'm going to have to do in places where I've sanded the filler down to the wood and onto the surface of the rib. So I will end up varnishing over the filler material and the rib to make sure everything's sealed and contained. And since I took the advice of the people at Oratex, I ordered some extra material already, about 5 more yards. It's sitting here. It came with my adhesive, which is, last time I checked it, is still looking good. And hopefully next time my landing gear will be here. So I'm pretty stoked about that too. As always, thanks for coming along. Thanks for watching. If you have any questions or comments, put them down below. I'll try and get back to them. And that's a wrap. See you on episode 20.